The Making of the Modern World. Railroads, Part 2. Table of Contents, Railroads, Part 2. Railroads were a key part of the Industrial Revolution and the development of the modern world. The development of steam engines and the iron and steel industries were integrally related to railroads. And the steam locomotives and the railroad network were essential parts of the Industrial Revolution. Even to the present time, it is the railroads that carry a major part of the world's freight.
Narration by Dr. Sidney Soclof,
Zoe Phonemes,
and Nathan Koltove. For a complete discussion of YouTube navigation, please go to tiny.1/ytnavigator. Introduction. Railroads and Transportation. The Transcontinental Railroad.
The railroad was considered the most remarkable American technological feat of the 19th century. It was a vital trade, commerce, and travel link that joined the eastern and western halves of the late 19th century United States. The Transcontinental Railroad quickly ended the romantic yet far slower and more hazardous Pony Express and stagecoach lines that had preceded it.
The subsequent march of manifest destiny and the proliferation of the so-called Iron Horse across Native American land significantly accelerated the demise of Great Plains Indian culture.
The Pony Express from 1860 to 1861 proved that the Central route was viable during the winter. With the American Civil War raging and a secessionist movement in California gaining steam, the need for the railroad became more urgent. The Pony Express from 1860 to 1861 proved that the Central route was viable during the winter. With the American Civil War raging and a secessionist movement in California gaining steam, the need for the railroad became more urgent. Congress passed the Pacific Railroad Act in 1862 to establish two main railroad lines: the Central Pacific from the west and the Union Pacific from the east. Other rail lines could build feeder lines.
Each was required to build only 50 miles, 80 kilometers, in the first year. After that, only 50 miles, 80 kilometers, more were required each year. Besides land grants along the right-of-way, each railroad was subsidized: $16,000 per mile, $9,940 per kilometers, built over an easy grade; $32,000 per mile, $19,880 per kilometers, in the high plains; and $48,000 per mile, $29,830 per kilometers, in the mountains. The race was on to see which railroad company could build the longest section of track.
Talk of a transcontinental railroad to be the centerpiece of the United States manifest destiny started in 1830. Shortly after railroads began large-scale operation in the United States and English-speaking settlers began settling in Mexican-controlled California.
Much of the early debates were not so much over whether it would be built, but what route it should follow: a central route, avoiding the worst of the Rocky Mountains via the Platte River in Nebraska and the South Pass in Wyoming, or a southern route, avoiding the Rockies by going through Texas to Los Angeles.
A northern route that Lewis and Clark followed along the Missouri River would have gone through northern Montana to Oregon, and was considered impractical because of snow.
A New York City merchant, Asa Whitney, made the first public proposal for such a line in 1844. At that time, the United States did not hold outright possession of land west of the Rockies. Asa Whitney was the most prominent champion of the Central Route Railroad at this time. He envisioned a route from Chicago and the Great Lakes to Northern California, paid for by the sale of land to settlers along the route. Asa Whitney was a distant cousin of the cotton gin inventor Eli Whitney. In June 1845, Whitney led a team along the route to assess its capabilities. Whitney traveled widely to solicit support from businessmen and politicians, printed maps and pamphlets, and submitted several proposals to Congress, all at his own expense. Legislation to begin construction of the Pacific Railroad, called the Memorial of Asa Whitney, was first introduced to Congress by Representative Zadock Pratt. The U.S. exercised joint occupation of the Oregon Country until 1846, when, under a treaty with Britain, it gained possession of the Pacific coast between the 42nd and 49th parallels. Whitney's Railroad Convention proposed a line from the head of the Great Lakes at Duluth, Minnesota, to the Oregon Country.
After the Mexican-American War of 1848, the Mexican cession complicated the matter greatly by adding California, Arizona, and New Mexico to the U.S. Congress did not act on Whitney's proposal. California came under formal United States control in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo after the Mexican-American War. Settlement of California skyrocketed with the California Gold Rush of 1849. Concerns lingered that snow would make the central route to California impractical. A survey indicated that the best path for a southern route ran through the northernmost part of Mexico.
North-south sectionalism intruded when it was appreciated that west of the Missouri, any rail project would require a combination of federal and private efforts. The American practice in the hope of resolving the regional conflict. The Corps of Topographic Engineers was authorized in 1854 to undertake the Pacific Railroad Survey, which studied almost all the potential rail routes in the West.
Very full. In 1853, the United States made the Gadsden Purchase, acquiring the southern portions of what is now New Mexico and Arizona, so that the southern route would be entirely within the U.S.
However, Congress did not then agree to support construction on the southern route, or any route, as the decision became embroiled in the sectional dispute that turned into the American Civil War.
Whitney was to see the central route completed, although he was not formally involved.
The next big champion of the central route was Theodore Judah. Judah was chief engineer for the newly formed Sacramento Valley Railroad in 1852. Although the railroad was to go bankrupt, he was convinced that an adequately financed railroad could pass from Sacramento through the Sierra Nevada mountains to reach the Great Basin and hook up with rail lines from the east. In 1856, Judah wrote a 13,000-word proposal supporting a Pacific Railroad and distributed it to cabinet secretaries, congressmen, and other influential people. Judah returned to California in 1860. He continued to search for a more practical pass through the Sierras suitable for a railroad in the summer of 1860. A local miner, Daniel Strong, had surveyed a route over the Sierras for a wagon road, a route he realized would also suit a railroad. He described his discovery in a letter to Judah, and together, they formed an association to solicit subscriptions from local merchants and businessmen to support their proposed railroad.
From January or February 1861 until July, the Party of 10 led by Judah and Strong surveyed the route for the railroad over the Sierra Nevada.
Judah was to die before major construction began after contracting yellow fever while returning over the Isthmus of Panama from New York. where he was attempting to get financing to buy out the Big Four.
The Big Four and Central Pacific Railroad. Collis Huntington, a hardware merchant, heard Theodore Judah lecture at the St. Charles Hotel in Sacramento in November 1860, and he invited Judah to his office to hear his proposal in detail. Huntington was to change Judah's strategy of finding several investors. Instead, he sought to raise the money from 3 partners who initially invested $1,500 each and formed a board of directors. Mark Hopkins, his business partner, James Bailey, a jeweler.
Horizontal ellipsis. Leland Stanford, a grocer and the future governor of California, and Charles Crocker, a dry goods merchant. The investors became known as the Big Four, and their railroad was called the Central Pacific Railroad.
The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad began in 1863, shortly before the end of the Civil War. Its route from Missouri to California skirted the Confederate-held regions.
The first transcontinental railroad in the United States was built across North America in the 1860s, linking the eastern United States railway network with California on the Pacific coast.
Construction began in 1863 of the 41st parallel route, which had been selected to receive federal grants. Still, because of the outbreak of the Civil War, relatively little was accomplished on the Union Pacific Railroad before the end of the fighting in 1865.
The route followed the main trails used for the opening of the West, pioneered by the Oregon-Mormon-California trails and the Pony Express. From Omaha, it followed the Platte River through Nebraska, crossed the Rocky Mountains at South Pass in Wyoming, and cut down through northern Utah and Nevada in the Great Basin before crossing the Sierras to Sacramento.
In California, little affected by the war, construction was more rapidly advanced. By 1865, the original juncture of the Central Pacific and Union Pacific was moved eastward. The meeting occurred on May 10, 1869, at Promontory, Utah.
The route did not pass through the 2 biggest cities in the Great American Desert, Denver, Colorado and Salt Lake City, Utah. Feeder lines were built to service the 2 cities.
It was completed on May 10, 1869, at the famous Golden Spike event at Promontory Summit, Utah. It created a nationwide mechanized transportation network that revolutionized the population and economy of the American West. This network caused the wagon trains of previous decades to become obsolete, exchanging them for a modern transportation system.
It was not directly connected to the Eastern U.S. rail network when it started. Instead, trains had to be ferried across the Missouri River in 1872. The Union Pacific Missouri River Bridge opened and directly connected the East and West.
The Central Pacific laid 690 miles, 1,110 kilometers, of track, starting in Sacramento, California, and continuing through California, Nevada, and connecting with the Union Pacific Line at Promontory Summit in the Utah Territory. Later, the route was extended to the Alameda Terminal in Alameda, California, and shortly after that, to the Oakland Long Wharf in Oakland, California.
The Union Pacific laid 1,087 miles, 1,749 kilometers of track, starting in Omaha, Nebraska, and continuing through Nebraska, the Colorado Territory, the Wyoming Territory, and the Utah Territory, and connecting with the Central Pacific at Promontory Summit.
The Central Pacific had their track laying down to such a science that Charles Crocker claimed they could lay 10 miles of track in one day. The Union Pacific officials scoffed and bet that they could. With some planning and engineering, though, on April 28, 1869, they set the record by laying 10 miles of track in one day.
This is the Governor Stanford locomotive of the Central Pacific Railroad. Built in 1862 and shipped around Cape Horn to California. It was Central Pacific's first locomotive, and it is named in honor of the railroad's first president and ex-California Governor, Leland Stanford. The expansion of railroads out west to California was a major factor in the increase in the population of the state. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869 from Omaha to Sacramento.
Then, the Southern Pacific was built from Sacramento to the then small town of Los Angeles in 1876. Later, the AT&SF Railroad provided another link from the east to Los Angeles. The railroad's connections from the east to Southern California made it easy to transfer film production to this area. A few years later, other transcontinental railroads were built, including the Northern Pacific and Southern Pacific. This is the Lincoln Memorial, where Abraham Lincoln is said to have selected Council Bluffs, Iowa as the eastern terminus after visiting this site in 1859, under the employ of Thomas Durant. Once it was decided that the railroad would follow the central route rather than the southern route, there was little question that the western terminus would be Sacramento. However, there was considerable intrigue over the eastern terminus. Controversy and scandals, Charles Durant and Credit Mobilier.
Thomas Durant in the Union Pacific, in contrast to the relatively straightforward arrangements for the Central Pacific. The Union Pacific, which was to build nearly two-thirds of the track ultimately, was to be mired in controversy and scandals. At the same time, its controlling partner, Thomas C. Durant, got rich as he took advantage of lax or non-existent government oversight during the Civil War.
The enabling legislation for the Union Pacific required that no partner owns more than 10% of the stock. However, the Union Pacific had problems selling its stock. Durant enticed investors with a scheme where he would put up the money for the stock if they just put their names on it. Then Durant took the stock from the investors and controlled about half the railroad stock. The initial construction of the railroad went over land that Durant owned around Omaha. Being paid by the mile, the railroad built oxbows of extraneous track, never venturing further than 40 miles from Omaha in the railroad's first 2.5 years.
Durant paid an associate to submit the construction bid, who then handed it over to a company controlled by Durant, Credit Mobilier. Durant then manipulated the finances and government subsidies, making himself a fortune.
Durant manipulated market prices on his stocks by spreading rumors about which railroads would be connected to the Union Pacific. First, he ran up the stock of his M&M Railroad while secretly buying stock in the depressed Cedar Rapids and Missouri Railroad, CR&M.
Then Durant ran up the CH&M stock with new plans to connect the Union Pacific to it, at which point he began buying back the M&M stock at depressed prices. This is estimated to have raised $5 million for his cohorts and him.
Durant was to keep a low public profile in his schemes as he was only a vice president. He was to install a series of respected men, such as John Adams Dix, as railroad president. By July 4, 1865, the Union Pacific had not gone further than 40 miles from Omaha, even as the Central Pacific had been working away for 2.5 years.
With the end of the Civil War and increased government supervision in the offing, Durant hired his former M&M engineer Grenville M. Dodge to build the railroad. And then the Union Pacific began a mad dash west.
Despite the transcontinental success and millions in government subsidies, the Union Pacific faced bankruptcy less than 3 years after the golden spike, as details surfaced about overcharges. Credit Mobility had billed Union Pacific for the formal building of the railroad.
The scandal hit epic proportions in the United States presidential election in 1872, which saw the re-election of Ulysses S. Grant and became the biggest scandal of the Gilded Age. It would not be resolved until the congressman who was supposed to have reigned in its successes, but instead wound up profiting from it, was dead. Durant initially devised the scheme to have Credit Mobility subcontract to do the actual track work. Under Durant's guidance, the company charged Union Pacific often twice or more the customary cost for track work, thus, in effect, paying himself to build the railroad.
Lincoln asked Massachusetts Congressman Oakes Ames, who was on the railroad committee, to clean things up and get the railroad moving. Ames got his brother Oliver Ames, Jr., named president of the Union Pacific and also of Credit Mobility. Oliver Ames, Jr., in turn, gave stock options to other politicians while at the same time continuing the lucrative overcharges. The scandal was to implicate Vice President Schuyler Colfax, who was cleared, and future President James Garfield, among others.
The scandal broke in 1872 when the New York Sun published correspondence between Henrietta Macomb and Ames detailing the scheme. In the ensuing congressional investigation, it was recommended that Ames be expelled from Congress. But this was reduced to a censure, and Ames died within 3 months.
Durant was to leave the Union Pacific, and a new rail baron, Jay Gould, became the dominant stockholder.
Workers on the railroad.
Irish laborers built the majority of the Union Pacific track, as well as veterans of both the Union and Confederate armies. Mormons who wished to see the railroad pass through Ogden and Salt Lake City, Utah, were also employed.
Primarily, it was the Chinese built the Central Pacific track. Even though, at first, they were thought to be too weak or fragile to do this type of work.
But after the first day on which Chinese were on the line, the decision was made to hire as many as could be found in California, where most were gold miners or in service industries such as laundries and kitchens. Plus many more were imported from China.
Most of the men received between $1 and $3 per day. But the workers from China received much less. Eventually, they went on strike and gained a slight increase in salary.
In addition to track laying, which employed approximately 25% of the labor force, the operation also required the efforts of hundreds of blacksmiths, carpenters, engineers, masons, surveyors, teamsters, telegraphers, and even cooks, to name just a few of the trades involved in this monumental task.
On January 8, 1863, Governor Leland Stanford ceremoniously broke ground in Sacramento, California, to begin constructing the Central Pacific Railroad. The Central Pacific made great progress along the Sacramento Valley. However, construction was slowed, first by the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, then by the mountains themselves, and most importantly by winter snowstorms.
Consequently, the Central Pacific expanded its efforts to hire immigrant laborers, many of whom were Chinese. The immigrants seemed more willing to tolerate the horrible conditions, and progress continued. The increasing necessity for tunneling began to slow the line's progress. To combat this, Central Pacific began to use the newly invented and very unstable nitroglycerin explosives, which accelerated both the construction rate and the laborers' mortality.
Appalled by the losses, the Central Pacific began to use less volatile explosives and developed a method of placing the explosives in which the Chinese blasters worked from large suspended baskets, which were then rapidly pulled to safety after the fuses were lit. Construction began again in earnest.
The train pictured is the Jupiter which carried Leland Stanford, one of the Big Four owners of the Central Pacific, and other railway officials to the Golden Spike ceremony. Notice the Indians on the hill overlooking the train.
In the east, the progress started in Omaha, Nebraska, when the Union Pacific Railroad proceeded very quickly because of the open terrain of the Great Plains. However, they soon became subject to slowdowns as they entered Indian-held lands. The Native Americans living there saw the addition of the railroad as a violation of their treaties with the United States.
The American bison is a bovine mammal commonly known as the American buffalo or simply buffalo. Indian war parties began to raid the moving labor camps that followed the progress of the line.
The Union Pacific responded by increasing security and by hiring marksmen to kill the buffalo, which were both a physical threat to trains and the primary food source for many of the Plains Indians.
The Indians began killing laborers when they realized the so-called Iron Horse threatened their existence. Security measures were further strengthened, and progress on the railroad continued.
This is the Golden Spike National Historical Site in northern Utah. 6 years after the groundbreaking, laborers of the Central Pacific Railroad from the west and the Union Pacific Railroad from the east met at Promontory Summit, Utah.
On May 10, 1869, Stanford drove the Golden Spike or the Last Spike. It symbolized the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. This is now located at Cantor Art Center at Stanford University.
The hummer and spike were wired to the telegraph line so that each hummer stroke would be heard as a click at telegraph stations nationwide. The hummer strokes were missed, so the telegraph operator sent the clicks.
As soon as an ordinary iron spike had replaced the ceremonial spike, a message was transmitted to the East Coast and West Coast that read, "Done." The country erupted in celebration upon receipt of this message. Complete travel from coast to coast was reduced from 6 or more months to just 1 week.
The Transcontinental Railroad was authorized by the Pacific Railway Act of 1862 and heavily backed by the federal government. It was the culmination of a decades-long movement to build such a line and was one of the crowning achievements of the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, although completed 4 years after his death.
The building of the railway required enormous feats of engineering and labor in the crossing of plains and high mountains by the Union Pacific Railroad and Central Pacific Railroad. The two privately chartered and federally backed enterprises that built the line westward and eastward, respectively.
This shows the area in Utah of the Golden Spike near the northern end of the Great Salt Lake. This route was shortened in 1904 by the Lucin Cutoff across the lake.
This shows the location of the Golden Spike National Historical Site near Promontory Peak, Utah.
This is a poster dated May 10, 1869, announcing that the railroad from the Atlantic to the Pacific is now open and running.
Aftermath. When the Golden Spike was driven, the rail network, in reality, was not connected to the Atlantic or Pacific. It merely connected Omaha and Sacramento.
In November 1869, the Central Pacific finally connected Sacramento to San Francisco Bay in Oakland, California.
The Union Pacific would not connect Omaha, Nebraska to Council Bluffs in Iowa across the Missouri River until completing the Union Pacific Bridge in 1872.
The Lucin or Great Salt Lake Cutoff is a 102-mile, 164 kilometers railroad line in Utah that runs from Ogden to Lucin, Utah. It considerably shortens the distance on the Transcontinental Railroad. It was completed in 1904. The original 1869 route was longer because it detoured around the Great Salt Lake.
The most prominent feature of the Lucin Cutoff was a 12-mile-long, 19 kilometers, railroad trestle crossing the Great Salt Lake, which was in use from 1904 until the late 1950s when it was replaced by an earthen causeway.
The Central Pacific and the Southern Pacific Railroad combined operations in 1870 and formally merged in 1885. The Central Pacific Railroad now became part of Southern Pacific Lines.
The Union Pacific originally bought the Southern Pacific in 1901, but in 1913 was forced to divest it. The company once again acquired the Southern Pacific in 1996. Much of the original right-of-way is still in use today and owned by the Union Pacific.
Visible remains of the historic line are still easily located, and hundreds of miles are still in service today, primarily through the Sierra Nevada mountains and canyons in Utah and Wyoming.
While the original rail has long since been replaced because of age and wear, and the road upgraded and repaired, the lines generally run on top of the original, handmade grade.
Vista points on Interstate 80 through California's Truckee Canyon provide a panoramic view of many miles of the original Central Pacific Line and snowsheds that made winter train travel safe and practical. Current passenger service. Amtrak runs a daily service from Emeryville, California, San Francisco Bay Area, to Chicago. The California Zephyr. The Zephyr consistently uses the original first Transcontinental Railroad track from Sacramento to Winnemucca, Nevada.
Popular culture. This is a poster for the movie Union Pacific. This 1939 film, directed by Cecil B. DeMille, portrayed the fictional Central Pacific investor Asa Barrow's obstructing attempts by the Union Pacific from reaching Ogden, Utah. The investigator, played by Joel McCrea, saves the railroad and gets the engineer's girl, played by Barbara Stanwyck.
The opening of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 demonstrated that the market for the profitable operation of such a line still lay somewhat in the future. One eastbound and one westbound train a week were adequate to meet traffic demands. It wasn't until 1883 before additional rail lines to the West Coast, with the Northern Pacific Railway reaching Puget Sound, and the Santa Fe to Los Angeles in 1885.
Soon after, the Canadian Pacific reached Vancouver, British Columbia in 1885, and the Great Northern arrived in Seattle in 1893.
By 1877, the Southern Pacific Railway had connected San Francisco to Los Angeles, and by 1887 had extended up the Pacific coast to Portland, Oregon.
The American rail network was complete by 1910 when the last major Western line was the Western Pacific Railroad from Salt Lake City, Utah to Oakland, California.
This later became part of the Denver and Rio Grande Western, DNRGW, Railroad with connections from Denver to Oakland. The American rail network was complete by 1910 when the last transcontinental line, the Western Pacific Railroad to Oakland, California, was opened. Santa Fe, Great Northern, and Southern Pacific Railroads.
This is a map of the Santa Fe route and subsidiary lines, as published in 1891.
This is a Santa Fe publicity photo of the 1951 Super Chief.
The survey on the 49th parallel was in the mid-1890s transformed into the Great Northern Railway. A near neighbor, the 47th parallel survey, had in the early 1880s been followed by the Northern Pacific Railway.
The 41st parallel survey sketched the alignment of the first Transcontinental Railroad, the Union Pacific east of Great Salt Lake and the Central Pacific west. The 35th parallel route became the Rock Island Line from Memphis to Tucumcari, New Mexico, and westward from there, the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway to Los Angeles. This is the Rock Island Line from Memphis to Tucumcari, New Mexico, and westward from there, the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway goes to Los Angeles. The southernmost route, along the 32nd parallel, was to run from Shreveport, Louisiana, across Texas, and then through the Gadsden Purchase of 1853 to San Diego. This route became the line from Los Angeles to El Paso.
Diesel-electric locomotives appeared in the 1920s. Individual locomotive units provided up to 5,000 horsepower, a figure equal to all the steam engine power in the United States in 1800.
Locomotive units could be multi-coupled and operated by a single engineer. It became routine to run unit trains containing 100 to 150 freight cars, semi-permanently coupled together and operating over a single long run carrying a single commodity, most commonly coal but also other minerals or grains.
Not only did diesel-electric locomotives make such routinization of freight operation possible, but they also reduced labor demands greatly. Refueling engines required only pumping heavy fuel oil at infrequent intervals. Locomotives frequently ran coast to coast with only changes of crew and refueling.
Standard time zones.
The trains ran on time. On November 18, 1883, the American Railroad Association announced that railroads would adopt standard time zones.
There were 4 defined time zones for the U.S., Pacific, Mountain, Central and Eastern, and all railroad schedules were thus coordinated on these standard times.
These are the 4 U.S. time zones: Pacific, Mountain, Central and Eastern.
The Royal Observatory of Greenwich, founded in 1675, established Greenwich Mean Time, GMT, the mean solar time at that location, as an aid to mariners to determine longitude at sea, providing a standard reference time while each location in England kept a different time.
By 1929, the majority of countries had adopted hourly time zones based on a standard offset from GMT or Coordinated Universal Time (UTC), dividing the Earth into 24 time zones, each one apart. Thus, Eastern Standard Time (EST) in the US is UTC-5. CST is UTC-6. MST is UTC-7. And PST is UTC-8.
Railroads go bankrupt. Burdened by excessive regulation and heavily subsidized competition, 9 Class I railroads, representing almost 1/4 of the industry's trackage, filed for bankruptcy protection in June 1970. The giant Penn Central declared bankruptcy. At the time, it was the biggest corporate bankruptcy in U.S. history. A Class I freight railroad has a revenue greater than $250 million. Class II railroads have between $20 million and $250 million. And Class III revenues are less than $20 million.
Throughout the 20th century, the ownership and organization of U.S. railroads changed. Mergers were common, and the bankruptcy of Penn Central Railroad in 1970 became the nucleus around which several northeastern railroads were joined into a nationally owned Consolidated Rail Corporation Conrail.
Within months after the Penn Central bankruptcy, several railroads applied for Interstate Commerce Commission permission to abandon passenger service. Freight service was modestly profitable, but passenger service was, as virtually everywhere else in the world, possible only with substantial government subsidies.
This chart shows the consolidation of U.S. railroads over the years.
These are the 4 largest U.S. railroad companies: BNSF, Union Pacific, Norfolk Southern, and CSX.
Railroads have transformed almost every aspect of human life. By the early 1830s, a person could travel faster than a galloping horse on land for the first time. The steam train revolutionized human existence by speeding up the pace of life. Railway development increased rapidly so that by 1850, the United States led the world, with a greater mileage than England and France put together.
These are the total railroad track mileages of the top 20 countries. We see that the U.S. leads with almost 150,000 miles, followed by China with 110,000 and Russia with 86,000 miles.
In 1933, the U.S. railway mileage was about 258,000, over 12 times that of Great Britain.
These are railroads in the U.S. in 1860. These are railroads in the U.S. in 1890.
The current railroad network. The American railroad network is made up almost entirely of the major freight railroads. The total mileage is about 238,381,000 kilometers.
The Majo Class I railroads are 1. Burlington Northern Santa Fe, 27,150 miles, 43,440 kilometers. The BNSF Railway Company is primarily a consolidation of the Burlington Northern Railroad and the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway, often called the Santa Fe. In 1996, the name was officially changed to BNSF Railway Company in 2005.
2. Union Pacific, 27,900 miles, 44,635 kilometers. 3. CSX Corporation, 23,125 miles, 37,000 kilometers. This is a CSX locomotive.
4. Norfolk Southern, 21,500 miles, 34,400 kilometers. And 5. Southern Pacific, 13,000 miles, 21,000 kilometers.
This is the Union Pacific Railroad passenger schedule of May 1869.
Period. The railroad, with its speed and its certainty because the trains ran on schedules, made possible the rise of the factory and its system of mass production.
The consolidation of the railroads. What became of that railroad?
In 1968, the Pennsylvania Railroad merged with its longtime arch rival, the New York Central Railroad. The Pennsylvania Railroad absorbed the New York Central and eventually went by the name of Penn Central Transportation Company.
Penn Central went bankrupt in 1970 and merged into Conrail in 1976. Conrail was broken up in 1999, and portions of its system were transferred to CSX and Norfolk Southern Railway.
After Conrail was divided between the Norfolk Southern Railway and CSX Transportation, most of the former Pennsylvania Railroad's remaining trackage went to Norfolk Southern.
Railroads consolidate and recover.
A significant factor in the recovery of railroads is the intermodal shipments of containers. This is moving freight by two or more modes of transportation. By loading cargo into intermodal containers, shipments can move seamlessly between trucks, trains, and cargo ships. In 2012, intermodal revenue, approximately $15 billion, surpassed coal, $14.3 billion, as the top source of U.S. freight rail industry revenue. Containers are generally more efficient than trailers because they can be double-stacked. https://www.r.of-americas-freight-railroads/number. Amtrak is born. The Rail Passenger Service Act of 1970 created Amtrak to take over intercity rail passenger service. Amtrak officially began service on May 1, 1971. This is a map of the Amtrak system.
In the United States, the strong emphasis on highways and air travel facilities had, by the 1960s, caused most railroads in the United States to cut their passenger operations drastically. In the Northeast megalopolis extending roughly from Boston through New York City to Washington, D.C., however, the dense population presented a market that a fast modern rail passenger service could exploit.
In 1976, Amtrak, which had taken over the train service in 1971, also took over the route. At the same time, a federally funded Northeast Corridor Improvement Project was begun to upgrade the route for high speed and extend to Boston its existing electrification.
The Northeast Corridor, NEC, is a 457-mile, 735 kilometers, railway line connecting highly urbanized areas in the U.S. It is the busiest railroad in North America, stretching from the north to the south and passing through 8 states. It starts from Boston, Massachusetts, and ends at Washington, D.C., via New York, and links several intermediate cities to the District of Columbia. In the first third of the 20th century, electrification of standard railroads, which came first on the B&O in 1895, proceeded. Never as widespread as in Europe. Electrification is mainly associated with the northeastern United States.
This regional concentration of electrification has meant that only between Boston and Washington, D.C., where the federally assembled Amtrak system owns the infrastructure, was there a potential in the early 1990s to seek easy high-speed rail development. Experimental high-speed projects began in this northeast corridor in the 1960s when both Amtrak and the New Haven Railroad diesel-electric turbotrains began running.
By 1991, the route between New York and Washington could be run at high speed by Metroliner trains. Lightweight, 7,000 horsepower electric locomotives of Swedish design haul the Metroliners.
The Metroliners attained 125 miles per hour speeds in the best sections, while the turbotrains on the curving trackage between New Haven and Boston seemed unable to operate at much more than 100 miles per hour.
In the face of severe airline shuttle competition, Amtrak's frequent train service has become the dominant public passenger carrier in the New York to Washington corridor in 1990. Amtrak claimed more than one-third of the combined rail and air passenger market between the two cities. Railroads moved about 12 million containers, about 72% of the total, and trailers, about 28% of the total, in 2005. Railroads move about 65% of the coal used to generate about 60% of the electricity in the U.S.
Railroads moved about 42% of the intercity freight, about 1.6 trillion ton-miles in 2001. This is the equivalent of almost 5,300 ton-miles of freight for every person in the U.S., or the equivalent of about 100 million trucks driven 1,000 miles, each carrying 15 tons.
From steam to diesel. This shows the transformation from steam to diesel that took place between the 1930s and 1960s.
Modern diesel-electric locomotives are much too large to be manufactured on an assembly line. They typically weigh more than 200 tons, 400,000 pounds, and range up to 6,000 horsepower.
This is a modern diesel-electric locomotive.
Energy efficiency.
How does road transport via trucks compare with rail?
Railroads are more energy efficient and less polluting than trucks. A diesel-electric locomotive can move 1 ton of freight an average of 379 miles, 610 kilometers, per gallon of diesel fuel. This is 3 times the fuel efficiency of a truck.
The force that resists the motion of a body rolling on a surface is called the rolling resistance, or the rolling friction. The rolling resistance, F sub r, can be expressed by the generic equation F sub r equals C times W, where C is the dimensionless coefficient of rolling resistance, and W is the weight of the object.
These are the rolling resistance coefficients for various wheels and surfaces. We see that the railroad steel on steel, railroad steel wheels on steel rails, has the lowest rolling resistance coefficient, 5 to 10 times smaller than truck tires on asphalt.
Rolling friction comes mainly from the slight deformation of the wheel and rotor rail surface in general. Larger wheels have lower coefficients of rolling friction.
It is the railroad steel on steel, the railroad steel wheels on steel rails, together with economy of scale factors, such as the large locomotives and long trains, sometimes more than 50 or even up to 100 cars long, that make the railroads the most efficient form of land transportation. Railroads are indeed second only to water transportation, with river barges and large cargo ships, in the economy of transportation.
Diesel locomotives are also 3 times cleaner than trucks based on air emissions per ton moved.
Here is a quick comparison between rail and truck transportation.
Recommended videos, Railroads. Part 2.
Recommended video, How do steam locomotives work? Steam engines explained. Recommended video, How do steam engines work? Recommended video, Steam engine, how does it work?
Recommended video, How a steam engine works. Recommended video, James Watt's steam engine. Recommended video, Steam engine, how does it work? Recommended video, The first trains of the Industrial Revolution. Trains that changed the world. Absolute history.
Recommended video, The American Railroad, a history. Recommended video, How a steam locomotive works, Union Pacific Big Boy.
Recommended video, How a diesel-electric locomotive works.
Recommended video, The Transcontinental Railroad, The History of American Westward.
Recommended video, The Transcontinental Railroad Unites America.
Recommended video, History of American Railroads, explained in 20 minutes.
Recommended video, Amtrak's next generation of high-speed rail.
Recommended video, YouTube navigation. Table of contents, Railroads, Part 2.
Thanks for watching. Please watch some more of my great videos.